where he earned a certificate in Arab Studies. He holds a law degree from Georgetown University Law Center, and after working in the field of finance, he returned to school and in 2008 received a Master of Arts degree in history from George Mason University. And if any of you know of his skills in that department, he has a book on historic Occoquan. That's an incredible book. And he usually has copies. So when we have events, Occoquan events, whatever, Earnie does have the book, and it is a great read if you have the time to get a hold of that book. It's wonderful. He's a very active member in various civic organizations, and has served as treasurer for Prince William Trails and Streams Coalition, the Occoquan Historical Society, the Prince William Public Library System Foundation, the Patriots for Disabled Divers, and the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association. In addition, he serves as secretary of the Prince William Historic Preservation Foundation. He is our charter president of our Optimist International Club of Occoquan, Woodbridge, Neabsco. He's a board member of Historic Prince William and Friends of the Fairfax Archaeology. He's also a member of the Occoquan Water Trail League, the Prince William Committee of 100, the Lake Ridge Lions Club, and a graduate of Leadership Prince William. In 2009, he was honored with the Roy Rosenwig Alumnus of the Year Award from George Mason University, Department of History and Art History. And he enjoys astronomy. If you ever get to talk with him about that, it's really fascinating, and he's very much knowledgeable in that area. Also, he loves biking, kayaking, stand-up paddleboarding, rock climbing, and the martial arts. And he holds a second-degree black belt in the Korean martial art of Hapkido, but I've never seen him challenge anyone at meetings. Yeah. In November of 2010, he authored the book on Occoquan in Arcadia Publishing's Images of America series. And in 2013, he started a sightseeing shuttle business that brings travelers on Amtrak's auto train to the town of Occoquan. And Ernie, we appreciate your being moderator, and I will yield the floor to you, please. You have to hold it close to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jack, for that introduction. Thank you. Okay, that's okay. I know this will be fun. Thank you, everybody, for coming. There's 2 minutes left. And then the green is time is half gone. And the pink is 1 minute left, at which point you'll shortly thereafter get the hook if you haven't stopped. So we're going to hold all our questions to the end. So we're going to let each of the panelists speak first for about 12 minutes. And just to introduce the topic, I want to say a few words. I was lucky enough to have a friend of mine who actually works for George Mason University's Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy, who actually sent me some studies that group has done, which I know Chief Hudson is familiar with. The one I saw was from 2010, so I suppose the data itself is probably 5 or more years older, actually. And at that point, in the study, it indicated, and this was a study that was done in Fairfax, it indicated that some 63% of the survey respondents had actually heard about license plate scanners, but some 90% of them had no idea whether they were in use or how they worked. And my guess is that those numbers probably have changed, but not too significantly. The privacy rights are something that I think many of us probably feel are constantly being tested because of the pace of technology, as well as our own decisions, conscious and unconscious, about how we use that technology. But the sense I get is that the public's interest in these issues waxes and wanes. And some of you who've been following the issues in the newspaper recently related to privacy have probably seen that. There was some momentum building for a little while in the Congress to actually reform or curb or alter some of the policies and practices of the national security, of NSA, for example, at the national level. But then very recently, just within the last week or so, there's been some pushback on that as people have become more concerned about terrorism threats. Additionally, some of you might have heard or read recently in the private sector that Uber, the car service, did folks see that? Well, an Uber executive had come out and basically said something to the effect of Uber has the capability and actually maybe we'll think about using it to track the movements and get some information on some journalists. Journalists, incidentally, were targeted because they happen to be critical of Uber. So there were concerns, of course, there at the national level that we've been hearing for a while. There are privacy concerns at the private level, at the corporate level, so to speak, or private sector level. And then there are privacy issues where the rubber meets the road. Those other two issues I mentioned tend to be a little abstract, I sense, for a lot of people. But what we're talking about tonight, and it's one of the reasons I think it's a great panel focus, is something that probably we can relate to as individuals a lot more than some of those other issues that are going on at the national level. And that is the use of technology in our communities for purposes that, for the most part, we probably, hopefully, feel are quite worthy causes. Law enforcement individuals, for example, already have a very, very difficult job. Technology can make that job easier for them. It also puts them, obviously, in a very difficult position, though, because while they're trying to protect us, they're also trying to respect our civil rights and our privacy rights. So those are the sort of things that I think we're going to obviously end up tackling in one way, shape, or form tonight with our panel. Now, what we agreed ahead of time we would do is we're going to start with Chief Hudson, and I've asked Chief Hudson to start because I suspect that a lot of folks are interested in finding out exactly how something like license plate scanners work and what the policies are in place for using them in Prince William County. So the Chief is going to set some of the background for us and actually educate us most broadly, I think, on the topic. Then we're going to turn to Frank, and Frank, your last name is Knaack, is that correct? Knaack? Okay. Frank is actually substituting for the person that we originally had on the panel who couldn't make it tonight, so thank you very much, Frank, for coming out and filling in with such short notice for us. He's from the ACLU, and he's going to be talking a little bit about the concerns and some of the issues that the ACLU has been dealing with regard to this type of technology for a while. And then we're going to end with Delegate Rich Anderson, my friend to the right here, who's actually been involved in some legislation at the state level with regard to this and is actually looking, frankly, for information from a variety of stakeholders to help inform any future legislation on the topic. So with that, let's start with Chief Hudson. I'm just going to very briefly, all of you, I think, if I understand correctly, have bios of the panelists at your tables. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the Chief. He's the commanding officer of the Prince William County Police Department, and he's committed, obviously, to providing efficient and interactive police service to the residents of Prince William County. He's responsible for the planning and direction of all department activities and is the final authority in all matters of policy, operations, and discipline. Chief Hudson has been a member of the Prince William County Police Department since 1982. And prior to his appointment as Chief of Police in February 2013, he had served as Assistant Chief of Police since 2008. So with that, let me turn it over to the Chief. One thing I've been asked by our sound technician to do is to encourage everybody to hold the mic right up against their mouths if they can. When it apparently drops like this, people can't hear us. Okay? Okay. Okay. All right. So, Chief, if you're comfortable with that, I'm going to turn this microphone here over to you, and I will take your seat. Okay, let's give a round of applause for the Chief.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you, Dr. Jack and the rest of the Committee of 100 for hosting us tonight and facilitating this panel discussion. I'm honored to be a part of it, and I very much look forward to the fruit that will come from this discussion and others that are occurring around the state and indeed around the country. Mayor Porta asked me to explain a little bit of the background of LPR, what they are, what they do, how we use them in law enforcement. In this region, LPR really came to fruitful use post 9/11. And in our department specifically, we started using them about 7 or 8 years ago. And they came about through the Urban Area Security Initiative grants, UASI grants, specifically in the metropolitan area, the National Capital Region, to help in terrorist security purposes around what are obviously some of the most high-profile terrorist targets in the country. So around our region, we have divided the grant funding for license plate readers through UASI according to the size of the jurisdictions. And Prince William County has 12 such units, 11 of which are mounted on vehicles, and one is mounted on a trailer, so it can be deployed somewhere in a fixed site and can be moved around as necessary. What the devices actually do are capture, you may have seen cruisers around, police cruisers around, that have two kind of black boxes on the trunk, and they'll be just over the wheel well in the rear of the vehicle on either side. And they look down and to the back of where that cruiser is. Typically, the right one is down to the back, the left one is down to the right. And what they're trying to do is capture the images of license plates that cruiser goes by, either in the same direction or parked or in the opposite direction. They have a limited scope. For example, if I'm going down Route 1 with one of these vehicles and I'm in a 6-lane portion of Route 1, if I'm in the far right lane, I'm not going to be able to capture everything all the way over to the far side of the road on my left side. But they can typically capture 1 to 2 lanes over from where they're mounted. They are capable of capturing hundreds of images a minute, and they strive through their software to identify the characters on that license plate and then store that information in their database. The database is stored first in the internal server within the computer of that car, and then it is later transferred over to a server that we maintain with the police department. About 3 years ago, 14 or 15 law enforcement agencies in the National Capital Region entered into an MOU to share access to our respective servers, and that access is specifically restricted for law enforcement purposes only. So if an agency, for example, if Prince William County is engaged in an investigation and we're looking for a suspect's vehicle in and around our region, we can query the other servers of those participating MOU signees and find out if they have that image stored on their servers. If it is, they will turn over to us the information that they have, and then we then conduct our investigation into where those images were found, what day and time they were found, and whatever we can find out about the vehicle itself. One of the, I think, misperceptions about license plate readers is that they divulge to us, those of us who use license plate readers, the personal information of the vehicle owners or operators, and many people have even conveyed concerns like the police know when I'm going to the grocery store, or the police know when I'm going to my classes, or the police know when I'm going to my church. In fact, all it records for us is the image of the tag, and sometimes that image is not complete, but most times it is. It records the exact date, time, and location, and that's it. Along with that image is typically a small portion of the vehicle, and once in a while we can see a person inside the vehicle, but not all that often. And that person inside the vehicle is not identified in any way, shape, or form. We then have to take that information, that license plate data that we captured, and run it through the DMV servers or the Virginia Criminal Information Network servers, VCIN, just as we would any other license plate that we come across in trying to determine who is the registered owner of that vehicle, whether the vehicle's licensed properly, whether it's current on its registration, etc. That information is not in the LPR system. We have to do that separately. And all of the access to that kind of information is already governed under current state law. And as a matter of fact, abuse of that kind of a query by a law enforcement professional is a Class 1 misdemeanor that can be punished by up to a year in jail. If such information was abused for the purposes of sharing that with other people beyond the person running the query, or to be used for other criminal purposes, that becomes a felony offense. So I say all that to say that there are existing restrictions and parameters that occur that govern how we use that information. 90% of the law enforcement entities in Virginia who use such information, by their policies, also restrict the fact that it can only be used for legitimate law enforcement purposes for criminal investigations. There are some, and I can't give you an exact number, but there are some around the state who go so far as to also use it for things like collecting delinquent parking fines, looking at property tax violations, things like that. So if they have what they think are tax scofflaws in their jurisdiction, they can enter those license plates and go to look for those people. That is not used, LPRs are not used that way in Prince William County. As a matter of fact, I know of only one jurisdiction in Northern Virginia that has even done anything close to that, and that was only for parking violations. So once we have that information, the rest of us choose to only query that license plate reader data for criminal investigative purposes. We have a very limited number of people who have access to our data within the county police department. I would say we probably have approximately 50 or 60 trained operators who can drive those vehicles around. We try to deploy them as widely as we can, but obviously we can't get them out all the time. And those people have the ability to operate the system, and when necessary, a few of them can query it. We also allow our crime analysis people, those who are trying to gather data and analyze it for criminal investigative purposes, to access the LPR data. So within Prince William County, we have fewer than 30 of our over 600 staff members, sworn staff members, that have access to the LPR data. Beyond that, we also restrict the retention of that data to 6 months. The retention period varies across the state from agency to agency. And we are working with the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police, as well as chiefs across the state, to try to come to concurring positions in terms of what type of retention length we are all comfortable with. I've heard things mentioned from 1 day, literally, to a year or two in terms of what departments are currently doing. However, most of us, especially in Northern Virginia, have already agreed that somewhere in the area of 3 to 6 months would probably be a significant and fruitful balance of the obvious concerns over privacy and the collection of metadata and the potential abuses that can occur with that metadata, and the obvious investigative benefits of having such information available to us. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Throughout our area, we have a number of good, successful resolution of difficult cases, and in fact, violent cases, that have been solved through the use of historical data on license plate readers. I've heard many in the privacy caucus argue that the data should not be retained in any way, shape, or form absent a specific nexus to a criminal investigation. Obviously, with the rate that those cameras capture data, at the time it's captured, we don't have any idea whether there's a nexus to a criminal investigation or not. Many cases, criminal cases, are not even reported to us until days or even weeks later. And we've all seen difficult cases with sensitive issues such as sexual assaults where victims don't come forward for quite some time. So it's very, very difficult for us to say on the date that an image is captured whether or not that image is going to be useful to us down the road. I'll give you a current example. Those of you who are local to our community, and I know all of you are, know that we've had a couple of very difficult murders in the last 2 weeks. The most recent one occurred just within this past week. We're currently looking for a suspect. We just found out yesterday, and this murder happened, if I'm not mistaken, Sunday morning. Just yesterday, we found out that this suspect is on the run. We already have his vehicle, so we know he's not in that. And he is in the presence of a companion of his. And we were able to get that companion's vehicle information, so now we're looking for that. So we have been able to use historical license plate reader data in our county to try to find out if that vehicle has come through any of our license plate reader cameras, if we have an image of it, and if so, we can backtrack to determine if there's any pattern to that movement and possibly locate this person as well as the murderer. There have been some really good cases. I was talking with Mr. Alborn earlier, Arlington had a great case about 2 years ago where an elderly gentleman with Alzheimer's disease went missing, was reported by his family, and wasn't able to be found for almost 3 days. He was not in any of the areas they thought he would go. They were able to go into their license plate reader database and find that his vehicle had shown up in a particular neighborhood a number of times over the past 2 years. I take it back, it wasn't 2 years because their data was only kept for a year. So they were able to go to that neighborhood, and actually about a block away they located the vehicle, and they located him in the vehicle, unconscious, dehydrated, and the doctors told them later that within 2 hours that gentleman would have been dead. They were able to save his life through the use of historical data in the license plate reader system. So I point these out as examples of the obvious benefits of the retention of data for investigative purposes. It has to be well secured. It cannot be abused. And I talked about the fact that the license plate reader system does not capture personal information. It just gives us a tag, and then we have to turn around and do our own investigative processes to run that through the existing databases, which are already governed by state law. So it's important to remember those facts. Beyond that, we all agree that we have to secure our own data, we have to limit the retention of it, we have to limit the access to it, and we also have to provide audit accountability on the back end. So I recognize that there is a legitimate concern as to the potential abuse of such data, and I also offer to you that there is a very legitimate law enforcement use for the historical data, and with the proper balance, I think we can all strike a place that we're comfortable with. So thank you.
Thank you, Chief Hudson. Our next speaker is Fred Knaack from the American Civil Liberties Union. Thank you again, Fred, for filling in on relatively short notice. Frank is the Director of Public Policy and Communications for the ACLU of Virginia. In this role, he leads the organization's advocacy before state and local government bodies and oversees the design and implementation of the organization's communications strategy. Prior to joining the ACLU of Virginia, Frank was the Associate Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for the ACLU of Texas, where he developed and managed the organization's 4 statewide campaigns: criminal law reform, immigrants' rights, youth rights, and religious freedom. You didn't think it was going to get easier moving up here from Texas, did you, Frank? Okay. Frank also led the ACLU of Texas's successful efforts at the Texas legislature to pass legislation designed to help dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. Prior to joining the ACLU of Texas, Frank was a part of the ACLU Human Rights Program, where he researched domestic human rights violations and coordinated national advocacy campaigns designed to hold the United States accountable to its international human rights treaty obligations. With that, let me call Frank to the podium, and let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, everyone, for inviting me tonight. We're excited to be here. So I wanted to first start out by kind of giving this a little bit more of a framework that I think will be helpful to understand where we're coming from on this issue. And that's basically the concept that as citizens in a democracy, it should be up to us as citizens to decide the rules for law enforcement. And that it shouldn't be up to law enforcement to decide how they want to collect data, what length of time they want to collect that data, how they get to search people. All of those things should be done by us as citizens. And I also want to acknowledge that automatic license plate readers do serve a legitimate law enforcement purpose when they're properly used and used under guidelines that we think are appropriate. But there are a number of issues within the ALPR issue that we have serious concerns about. And the chief was talking about how ALPRs can't be used to predict your movements, and I think we would disagree with that. When you look at one picture, it has the geolocation stamp and the time stamp. You obviously can't tell a person's movements by that picture. But when you look at it at the macro level, when you get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these pictures put into these databases, and then when we're sharing those databases with those pictures with regional and statewide databases, you're creating a massive contingent of pictures that people can then use to accurately map your movements. And so they can be done using fancy algorithms because we are creatures of habit, at least I am, to know when I'll likely be at the supermarket next because I go to the supermarket on Friday nights, or when I would go to a restaurant, things of that nature, things that the government has no business knowing because I am a law-abiding citizen. In addition, they're able to map out our friends, our doctors, what church we go to. When you have an automatic license plate reader that drives through a church parking lot and takes pictures of all the cars in the church, all the license plates in the church parking lot are put into the database, then the law enforcement, if it happens every Sunday, they have a good idea that you probably go to that church. Or if you're seeing some kind of psychiatrist or doctor, and you go every week to see that on a Tuesday, and the law enforcement vehicle happens to drive by every other Tuesday, and they can see that, then in that system, they have a good likelihood that you are going to see that doctor. And so you can't predict with absolute certainty certain things, but you can have a good idea of what's going to be happening. And so that to us is very concerning. And I think, in addition, as Senator Peterson said last year, this is basically enabling law enforcement to find probable cause by algorithm, and that's something that's very, very concerning to us. Another issue that's concerning to us is the ability of ALPRs to create what we call a digital fence. And so they can go and say it's a Tea Party event, or say it's another group that maybe some folks don't have concerns with. Law enforcement can set up ALPRs outside of the venue, and they can record every license plate that goes into that parking lot outside the venue. And then say they do this every month, they can have a pretty good idea of who is in that group, and they can also tell who the more active people in that group are, and that's something that's very concerning to us, and it's also a backdoor around what the Supreme Court said law enforcement or the state can't do, and that's ask organizations for their membership lists. The Supreme Court said clearly that membership lists of private organizations is not public. They can, the Commonwealth or the government entity cannot force the government or the organization to turn that list over. But yet with ALPRs, they can get around that by just placing ALPRs at certain key locations. And I'm not saying that all law enforcement does this, but that has been done. And for example, when in 2008, when President Obama was having his inauguration, they set up cameras of every car going into the district that day, and they recorded all those license plates. And then after the Cuccinelli opinion, those were struck from the database. Another instance is these are computer systems, and they do malfunction. There's an instance in San Francisco of a woman named Denise Green. She was driving down the street in her car. It was just to be accurate, a burgundy Lexus. She drove by a law enforcement officer. The ALPR scanned the license plate. It beeped that it was a hot vehicle. He called to the folks in front of him that there was a burgundy Lexus coming by that was on the hot list. And instead of verifying that the car in the hot list matched the car that he was following, they just kind of told everyone that he'd used the car that he was following to describe the problem, the car they were looking for. They pulled the woman over. They came with guns, and they pulled her out of the vehicle. They put her on the ground with their guns trained on her, And a little while later, they realized that the license plate reader had been one digit off. And so if he had simply just looked to confirm that it was the right vehicle, it was actually a GMC truck that it was the stolen vehicle, they would have easily known that. So there are those kinds of problems that are raise serious concerns for us as well. Sorry. And then there are just basic abuse issues that we're concerned about. Law enforcement, I'm sure this is the vast minority of law enforcement, but law enforcement are human beings, and they do bad things sometimes, and we all know that. And when you're creating databases that have everyone's information in them in terms of their metadata and where they go on certain days, if you have a law enforcement officer who has something against an ex-wife or an ex-girlfriend or an ex-husband or ex-boyfriend, those can be exploited in these situations. You've actually seen instances in Massachusetts and New York where law enforcement have actually gone into these and used these programs to engage in very serious crimes. And so that's something we're concerned about as well. And we think there's a very simple solution to this. Back in February of 2013, then Attorney General Cuccinelli wrote a very, very good opinion. The opinion said that law enforcement can use ALPRs, which we agree, for active investigation. So if you're driving by and it goes off and the car's on the hot list, they should be able to use this technology. But what the AG opinion, what General Cuccinelli's opinion said they can't do is collect passive data. So that's data that has no existing use in an emergency or an ongoing criminal investigation, but that may be of use at some time in the future, and it's speculative. And so the AG opinion was very clear that they cannot do this, and we think that that's what the law should be, and we're hopeful that Delegate Anderson and others in the General Assembly this session will pass a law basically codifying General Cuccinelli's opinion, and we think that strikes the proper balance. And just as an example, in Ashland, they recently updated their policy with ALPRs. In Ashland, what it does is when one of the Ashland Police Department vehicles goes by another license plate and pulls that license plate in, it runs it through its system in the vehicle itself. If it doesn't match a car in the hot list or an amber alert or a senior alert, then it expels that data. That data is never kept, and so it's being used for that real-time purpose that we think ALPRs serve a legitimate purpose for. And so I'm happy to answer any questions afterward if you all are interested.
Thank you very much, Mr. Knaack. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here first. You're not going to hear that very often, the ACLU praising former Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli. So I want to make sure all of you caught that. So thank you very much. Okay, the last person who's going to speak is Delegate Rich Anderson. Delegate Anderson represents the 51st House District in the Virginia General Assembly. He retired as a full colonel from the United States Air Force in February 2009 after 30 years of service on active duty. He served for the first half of his military career in the Air Force Missile and Space Career Field, and later served during the second half of his career in international affairs billets in the Political Military Affairs Career Field. He is a resident graduate of the Air Command and Staff College, Joint Forces Staff College, and Air War College. His military awards and decorations include the Legion of Merit, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, the Air Force Meritorious Service Medal, the Air Force Commendation Medal, the Combat Readiness Medal, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, and numerous other decorations. Now, before he steps up here, I do also want to mention that he did serve a term as my delegate, and although we are different parties, I can tell you with no hesitation that he was an outstanding delegate. He would actually come to Occoquan Town Council meetings where you could watch the sausage be made. So it was not really the most exciting venue, but nevertheless he came down and quite frankly spent a lot of time and worked very hard for us in the town of Occoquan. So I'm very pleased actually to call him a friend as well. So please, Delegate Anderson.
Well, now that Mayor Porter has established that I can't hold a job. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to engage in this discussion on the community square about what I think is a compelling issue for our time. Because with the advance of technology, our experience from the latter part of the 20th century up to the present is that technology always stays ahead of the rule set. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here, is to articulate a plausible, workable, reasonable rule set that strikes a balance between reasonable law enforcement needs to provide and protect for the citizens of the Commonwealth and largely in the country, and to balance that with the simple civil rights to simple privacy. And so that's what we're trying to do here. The chief talked to you about and focused on security concerns, and Frank Knaack talked to you about privacy concerns. And I am somewhere in the middle trying to achieve a blend here of how to provide for both. As has been said, there is a legitimate need for license plate readers and that capability to fight crime in our communities. And as Chief Hudson's predecessor, Chief Dean, said to me in a phone call earlier this year when we were considering this legislation in Richmond, he said, just Rich, please don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so we're not trying to throw out baby or bathwater. We're trying to find a way to come out at the end with a clean babe in swaddling clothes. And so with that, the thing that really drove this and introduced me to the subject, which is something I didn't know about previously, was in January of this year, as we convened the 2014 legislative session of the General Assembly. Several folks came to me and articulated their concerns about the issue of license plate readers. And that has taken on a life of its own. We probably wouldn't be having this conversation had it not been for the things that have occurred at the national level. That's driven these conversations on the state and local level. And so as a result, we now find ourselves having this conversation. The day when our legislation was due, and I was going to the opening caucus session before we convened on the House floor for the first time of the session, I had my folks huddle and with some others and to draft quickly a piece of legislation that we dropped in the hopper. We did so in the face of Attorney General Cuccinelli's February 2013 opinion regarding LPRs, which essentially said that LPRs may not be used by law enforcement agencies to collect information not directly related to a criminal case. That's kind of how it boils down. The Virginia State Police pretty quickly embraced that policy immediately, but various jurisdictions around the state embraced differing levels of retention periods. For instance, in Northern Virginia, Alexandria retains for 2 years, Fairfax and Loudoun for 1 year, and Arlington and Prince William counties for 6 months. The discussion and the issue before us is certainly about what should trigger the collection, and then for the data collected, how long should it be retained? And we can talk about that in greater specificity as we get on in the discussion. But the important thing for me tonight, and for all of us, is to hear from you and your perspectives, because that will greatly impact when it comes time within the next few weeks for Senator Chap Peterson and I to sit down and articulate on paper what we want to codify in a proposed bill. And at that time, any interested parties, any agencies, any organizations, any private citizens will have the opportunity to step in front of the appropriate legislative committees and, of course, to articulate that perspective, and that will shape the final outcome. Now, after we submitted this bill earlier this year, quickly after I had submitted a bill, Senator Peterson, within a day or two, simply took my language and dropped it into a bill of his own so that two pieces of legislation would be in play simultaneously in the House and Senate. But very quickly, it became apparent to me in talking to local law enforcement and principally our home law enforcement folks, as well as the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police, the Virginia Sheriff's Association, the Virginia Association of Commonwealth's Attorney, as well as others, that perhaps it might be appropriate for us to take a deep breath and to permit this conversation to continue over the space of the year, where we can engage at greater depth, not only with citizens, but with law enforcement officials throughout the Commonwealth who are, in fact, the subject matter experts. And that's precisely what we've been doing. One of the things that I found to be very unexpected and unusual is that it became apparent to us immediately in the process that two very disparate groups, namely the American Civil Liberties Union and the Virginia Federation of Tea Party Patriots, were in complete agreement on this. And that's when we thought we might be onto something. And so in early September, we convened a summit in Richmond with those two groups to talk. It was a very productive enterprise. And then after that, we did a broader meeting of an organization that together Senator Peterson and I formed called the Ben Franklin Privacy Caucus. We did that in the Virginia State Capitol a few weeks after the first get-together and collected further information, data, and perspectives from folks across the Commonwealth. So to bring this to closure and move on to the broader discussion, my concern is not about, per se, the collection of the data. It's not about a false positive that Frank had described. It's not about those sorts of things, because I have absolute confidence and full faith in the integrity and the business models and practices of the chief and his people. They are badged, sworn, and armed to protect us, and they do an exemplary job of doing that. What I'm worried about is two things. Number one, the creation of massive data systems that we have found can be easily breached or can be put to other use, much as the Social Security number system of the United States, when created in 1936, was supposed to be used for payroll and retirement entitlements for that purpose, but is morphed into larger things. The second thing is with the creation of these data systems in a modern 21st century age, it's hard to go a week or two or even a month at most without picking up the newspaper or seeing in the media about a breach of these data systems by outside interlopers. So with that, I do believe this is really a preeminent issue that impacts us all. We were all expecting the Orwellian 1984. It didn't happen in 1984, but now that we are in the early portion of the 21st century, I think it is here, and it is important that we address this genie before it's completely out of the bottle, because a genie out of the bottle is like toothpaste out of the tube. Try to get it back in. So thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move on to our question portion of the evening. I want to go over some of the ground rules very quickly. The first thing is that we ask that committee of 100 members be the first individuals to ask questions. Those who are not members are welcome to ask questions, but we do give preferential treatment to committee of 100 members. So we ask if you have a question, you raise your hand to be recognized, and then once recognized, please stand and state your name and your city or magisterial district. We also, of course, ask that you get to your question without a lengthy comment, and if possible, please indicate the panelists to which your questions are addressed. Follow-up questions are okay, but take some cues from me on that, because we might want to sort of put those aside until the end, until everyone's had an opportunity to ask a question, or we might tack it on right there if it's particularly relevant. I'm going to start, if it's okay, by asking a question of the chief. I understand from having spoken with some folks out in the audience actually tonight who have been involved in the past in operations where they have had access to private information, that one of the concerns that they have had as a result over time is they are very familiar with human beings being human beings, and as a result periodically misusing their position to access the data for personal reasons, personal reasons that have nothing to do with the job that they're carrying out at the time. And Chief Hudson, you mentioned that there are obviously penalties for that. So could you talk a little bit about how that sort of access is monitored, and then also the extent to which the data that is collected is shared, if at all, with anyone outside of the Prince William County Police Department?
The monitoring of the data is currently still a work in progress. The company that we use has created a software that allows for auditing and accountability post-fact. That is being rolled out as we speak throughout the National Capital Region. We are still in the queue waiting to have it installed, but we hope to have it any day now, literally. That will give us the ability to proactively do spot checks as well as scheduled checks to see who is accessing the data. We currently do those types of checks, but we have to do them manually. And I can tell you, for example, from February 1st to the current date in this year, I've had just over 300 queries of our data by our folks for investigative purposes. Each of those can be tracked to specific case numbers and specific investigations so that we can demonstrate that there is a legitimate law enforcement need for that query. And part two of your question was
the extent, if any, to which the data that you collect is actually shared with any agencies outside of the county.
As I spoke about earlier, it's only shared with those signees of the Memorandum of Understanding throughout the National Capital Region. Currently, there are 13 or 14 agencies signed on to that agreement. They all agree to the stipulation that a query of any participating agency's LPR data can be conducted only for legitimate law enforcement purposes for criminal investigations. Once they do a query of our data, if they find that we have a license plate on our system, they then send that information to us and we pull the data. They don't physically access our server. We pull the data, we send them the dates and times, et cetera, and then it's up to them to do the remainder of the investigation.
Okay, thank you. And Fred, if you don't mind, Mr. Knaack, I'm going to follow up to that question with a follow-up to you. You gave the example of the misidentification of a number, which presumably some of us might react to and say, well, that can actually happen with a police officer or any law enforcement officer at any time. They might just mess up or make a mistake and get get the numbers transposed. Have you had any complaints to the ACLU about situations where the data has clearly been or allegedly been accessed for personal, non-law enforcement reasons?
At the ACLU Virginia, excuse me, I have not seen any, no, that we've had complaints, but we've had complaints. There have been instances around the country where this has happened. And our concern is that we just have policies in place before these technologies are deployed to kind of minimize the chance of that happening.
Thank you. I did want to follow up on Frank's point, and the instance that he cited is a very egregious situation that I certainly wouldn't want to see anywhere, and I appreciate the concern for that. The current policies that we use absolutely forbid the kind of practices that officer in San Francisco engaged in. As a matter of fact, it would be similar to us going out to serve a search warrant on a house and kicking the door into a wrong house and abusing people within that house. And we would take very severe action against the officer conducting such an action.
Okay, questions from the audience? Yes. Here comes your microphone.
Carol Knaack, I'm in the Gainesville district, and I was just curious after what Frank said about monitoring parking lots and doctor's offices and so forth. So I wanted to ask the chief, besides on the street and on the road, where you actually are collecting that data.
The license plate reader system on a police cruiser typically operates whenever that cruiser is being driven and operated, when it's turned on and being driven around. So wherever that cruiser may go, those cameras may capture images. That could include parking lots, obviously. For the most part, we find that 95+% of our vehicle captures occur on public roadways.
Clancy.
This is for the chief. Chief
Clancy, tell everybody who you are. Not.
Oh, I'm sorry,
we know,
Clancy
but for the
McCoy, Occoquan, Virginia. I'm a cousin of Ernie's. Anyway, my question is for the chief. What would you think of making a rule like, you know, you got law enforcement that's active and is looking for license plates and it goes after them if it finds them in the current scan. And then you want to keep them from some period of time afterwards, say 3 months or 6 months, whatever you're using. What do you say we change it so that only new law enforcement activities can go against the historical database and not old law enforcement activities? So that people are, you know, essentially only current stuff is going out. It takes care of the person who's an Alzheimer's patient who's reported a week later as being missing in action. And that way we don't have to restrict the collection of the data any longer than we need to, but it's only used for new purposes rather than old purposes.
I'm not sure that I'm gathering your question correctly.
In other words, you can't use it for anything you want, anytime you want. The only thing you could use it for is new law enforcement activities.
Okay.
If you didn't have a current law enforcement activity when you collected it, you wouldn't have dinged it, all right? You only ding it if it's a current law enforcement question and the license plate is in your database of those that you're looking for.
Yeah, so Chief, maybe you can explain, because I think I'm a little confused on this too. When the data is collected, what then prompts a police officer to then go look at the data? Because it's just being sort of randomly collected as they drive around, right? So as I understand, Clancy is saying, well, then you ding a license plate for one reason or another, it gets pulled out of that data collection.
We only do a query of the database, and you're right, Mayor. All the images are captured, and those are stored in the database. But nothing is searched or queried without a legitimate investigative purpose.
Right.
So that would have to be the current need that we have. The retention of that other passive data, as Frank alluded to, stays in the system without being touched for any reason until and unless there is a legitimate law enforcement purpose to query it. And it only stays there for, obviously for us, 6 months. Other departments differ. We're looking at 6 months because we have seen several examples, and I have dozens in front of me, where we have captures that are 3 months, 4 months, 6 months old, and even longer, where we've found great suspect identification and in fact made successful prosecution with that historical data that was months old at the time that we did the query.
Okay, but that would be new historical data.
It's a current
Or a new
investigation.
Current investigation.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought of another one. Mayor stole mine. Scott Bell in the APSCO district. So I guess, Chief, this is for you, and then maybe Delegate Anderson.
Scott, put the,
I'm sorry, for all of you, probably as a follow-on. So we're talking mostly about mobile systems right now. Do you have any plans to put them at busy intersections or anything like that, similar to traffic cameras? Because at that point, you're collecting way more data than you are right now with just 12 cameras around the county. So I'm just curious if that was even a thought that you're thinking of right now, because that ratchets up the amount of information you're collecting.
We do not have any intention to do that at this point. I can tell you that such stationary systems are used in the district. And as I think Frank alluded to, there were situations where Virginia State Police was using them earlier, and those are no longer being done by Virginia State Police. We don't also use red light cameras or speed cameras in Prince William County, and I have resisted some requests to do so. So I don't have any intention of moving down the road of stationary systems in Prince William County. Frankly, I find more benefit from a mobile system that I can move around depending on where crime is occurring and use it as needed.
Okay, I think we have Al Alborn.
Yeah, Al Alborn, Coles District. A quick comment. While we're talking about the entire Commonwealth, I'd like to point out that you take a lot of the heat for what we're doing here, and this really is a Commonwealth issue. Thanks for your service here. We got a great police department. I appreciate it. This is really for Frank and the chief. I'm interested in the use of commercial data, the interchange between data collected by any police department and perhaps purchased from a commercial entity, and the FOIA availability, since I assume anything not involved in a criminal investigation is in fact FOIAble, of commercial enterprises collecting information that you, asking or FOIAing information you've collected, and would be happy to pay any FOIA fees you might have, and then reselling that. So a chat for both of you of what's the relationship with commercial enterprises? Because they're collecting this data too. They're buying it, selling it, and they can FOIA your data. How's that work?
I can talk more at the big picture level, and I'm not sure exactly what's happening here in Prince William County on this, but so private entities have their own systems for collecting data, and so they have their own databases. And I think a lot of times what we're seeing is the reverse of what you see elsewhere, where you have government entities actually purchasing the data from the private entity. And so there's an attempt now around in some places around the country to link ALPRs with visual, and so when it goes by and it scans the license plate reader, something would pop up on the screen with the person's picture, with their work history, with all this data that private entities have. And so it would give all this stuff that the government really shouldn't have right in front of them when this happens. And so we would love to work on legislation that would prohibit that. And it sounds like that's not the type of stuff that's happening up here in Prince William County, so that's terrific. And I'll let the chief.
That's only partially true. The commercial capture is, as Frank alluded, in our experience here, more on the private side, capturing that information and making it available in subscriber-based systems that can be accessed by law enforcement. One popular system is called the National Vehicle Locator System, NVLS, which offers free access through subscription to any legitimate law enforcement agency for, again, criminal investigative purposes. And we have successfully used that system a couple of times to resolve cases. We have not seen any of the opposite, where government information is being divulged to commercial enterprises for their further distribution through FOIA access or others. FOIA is a little bit of a gray area in terms of this data, and I'm glad you brought that up. And I'm very hopeful that through the efforts of Delegate Anderson, Senator Peterson, and others, that the legislative efforts in the next session will try to address some of that. Because as I spoke about earlier, I really want to be sure that this information is secured as best we can possibly secure it. As you know, personally, a FOIA request to our department for any information in our license plate reader will only be turned over to a person who owns the data being captured. In other words, you can file a FOIA request with us for your own vehicle, for example, registered to you, and we will give you that information if we have it in our system. If you ask for anybody else's information, we're not going to turn it over to you. As I said, this is a little gray in the current code sections, and I would like to see that tightened up in the next legislative session.
I'm sorry.
To speak to that, I'm a member of what's called the House General Laws Committee, and there are 3 subcommittees of that body. I chair the FOIA subcommittee, and I think that this is a worthy subject for us to address, and especially in the context of a 2-year-long overview of the body of law that deals with Freedom of Information Act here in Virginia. That's underway now because over the last decade plus, the body of FOIA law has grown by fits and starts and has resulted in a patchwork quilt network of exemptions and laws and that sort of thing. And we're hoping to clean that up. And I think probably I need to introduce this into the dialogue for sure.
Okay, folks, we're going to take about a 30-second break. Don't get up. We're going to take a 30-second break while we change the tape. While the change is being taped, I wanted to ask, since I mentioned NSA and Uber earlier, how many folks out there have used Uber in the audience? Okay. So did you read? You read the article. Did that concern you at all? You can just nod your head or say yes. Yes. Okay, I see heads nodding up and down. Okay. Okay, obviously it's an important distinction to make. That is not law enforcement. That is a private company. I have to confess myself being startled years ago when I first started using Facebook at the ads that popped up and said, how did they know I was interested in that? So,
Anybody need?
yeah.
Can I just say one quick thing?
Yes.
So we were talking about FOIA just a minute ago. We have a document that's in the back that has a blog on the front about what's happening in the Commonwealth right now, and on the back is actually a sample FOIA.
Pursue their own interests by knowing where vehicles are.
Okay, and so what if someone, you had spoken earlier about how there are laws that prevent certain misuses of license plate readers, and, I understand like insurance companies or wanting to track vehicles, but they usually do that through, I know car rental agencies can just track their own vehicles. But what if someone, say, an employee of the DMV had a license plate reader? They could use it and then they can go into technically their own systems. I mean, what is to prevent people from using license plate readers to invade the privacy of other members of the public?
Sure. The prevention of such actions would have to be undertaken in legislation. However, the actions that you're talking about, such as with the DMV employee, are already barred by current law. So if they were to abuse that kind of thing, clearly they would be subject to penalty under those laws.
So let me follow up on that, Mr. Knaack. Okay, you were going to respond to that. Well,
Yeah, just one quick thing. There's the Government Data Protection Dissemination Practices Act, and that is the law I was referring to earlier. I'm sorry, the Virginia Data Collection Practices Act. That only applies to state entities, so private citizens can do whatever they want. That's the Data Act is what Cuccinelli based his opinion on, which said that that's where he distinguished between active and passive collection, and he said active is okay, passive is not okay.
So and that leads into my follow-up. So, for example, if a battered spouse leaves, his or her spouse leaves, and the spouse then purchases a license plate reader and is following around or is trying to find out where the battered spouse is, there's nothing currently in the law that prevents that, correct? Other than
Like
something
restraining order or some type
right,
of
something like that was already in place, right?
Yeah, I mean,
So
there's harassment,
private-
stalking, there's a number of,
Right. So well, my point is, there's nothing that prevents you from using the technology whatsoever right now as a private individual, correct? Right. Yes.
Uriah Kaiser, Potomac Local. I think we've all been a little too easy on the delegate this evening, so I'm going to press the delegate on some issues here. Rich normally talks more. But I will ask this. Let's say I understand that you're on a fact-finding mission as you work across the Commonwealth with Senator Peterson. And let's say that that you don't get any more facts and you don't get any more feedback in the public. That's probably unlikely. But as your piece of legislation is shaping up today, can you sort of peel back the onion and give us a sense of how that's going to read, what that's going to look like?
Well, I think as a starting point, you could look at the 2014 legislation that we ultimately pulled, House Bill 1269 for those of you who like to look at the Legislative Information System, and Chap Peterson's companion bill was Senate Bill 670. They're identical in verbiage. For me, the two issues to be tackled are this, and this is a layperson's approach. Number one, I believe that we need to tackle the issue of what triggers a collection. And largely, I believe that should be one of two things. And again, this is me thinking out loud right now without being ready to take pen to paper. Number one, I think it ought to be with a court order or with a crime in progress that requires law enforcement to spring into proverbial action at the moment and to collect in a given geographic area so that they have the intelligence they need to solve a crime. That's number one. Number two, the issue to be confronted is how long should the retention be? Should it be a day? Should it be 3 months? Should it be 6 months? I'm not quite certain what that should be, but I believe that it should be at the lower end of those ranges. And I think that it needs to be established as a statewide standard, a statewide rule set, because in the face of, I believe, compelling views on the part of the public that we articulate these, that we need to, in fact, set a rule set. If we don't, then we failed to be the policymakers and have instead delegated that to a number of law enforcement jurisdictions across the states to, in fact, be policymakers rather than policy executioners.
So I'm going to follow up with the delegate then on that. So Delegate Anderson, would you characterize then the concerns primarily being concerns about the intent of the use or the use of technology, period? And that's why I used the stalking example earlier, because if the person is actually being stalked, then obviously we're concerned about the intent. But if we can't demonstrate the intent, the availability of the technology and the ability of a person to use that without restriction creates an issue, obviously.
Well, the focus of this has been to center on the Virginia, the precise, if you should find, you want to go home and Google it, the precise title is the Virginia Government Data Collection and Dissemination Practices Act. And that has to deal with what government does. And we have focused our proposed legislation earlier this year, and of course our 2015 legislation also will focus on the practices of public entities. What I find people are concerned about are not about, as I said earlier, law enforcement. There is a large scale of trust for law enforcement. In fact, every 2 years, Prince William County does a climate assessment of local community attitudes toward law enforcement. And I think, Chief Hudson, you probably watch this closer than me, but I want to say that it's somewhere around the 92 percentile, the low 90s, which is very good for any public agency. In other words, public confidence for law enforcement is pretty high. That said, they're concerned about the data that is collected and then goes into some sort of repository without any certain indication of who can access that, either authorized or unauthorized, and for abuses to happen. And again, as I said earlier, it's very much driven by the national dynamic that of the National Security Agency and others. So.
Anyone else? Any other questions? Okay, let me ask Delegate Anderson, are there any other issues that the, what did you call it, the Ben Franklin Privacy Caucus that you and Chap Peterson founded? Are there any other issues beyond this one that you might be working on that the group might be interested in?
Well, we had an inaugural meeting during the 2014 General Assembly session, had a press conference, unveiled it, the concept, and we had a broad cross-section of House and Senate members from both parties step forward to lend their voice to what we were attempting to do. Some of the issues that have been brought forward are, number one, concerns about a device that I have very little familiarity with, but I believe that the federal government principally are employing these devices. They're called stingrays. And as I understand it, at least in a very superficial sort of way, those are devices that can be erected in a geographic area, and they mimic the behaviors of a cell tower, and people believe that their phone is connected to a cell tower, and yet it is connected to this stingray device, which collects not only conversations and text messages, but also the stored content on a cell phone. That's of considerable concern. We're at the very early stages of where that's being used, and I believe that that's being used principally in some very confined federal sectors. So again, I don't profess to be as up to speed on that as I am on this other issue. The license plate reader issue is essentially our test case. It's the one that has commanded the most print and airtime right now, and as a result, it's what we're focused on. But I think we will probably see some other legislation that I'm not even anticipating when we get down to the General Assembly. One of the things that I am seriously considering and have been talking to several attorneys, I'm not an attorney, is perhaps proposing an amendment to the Virginia State Constitution, which would define essentially a Fourth Amendment within the text of our document that would be more broader, more all-inclusive, so that it would take into account a broad rule set impacting all sorts of different technologies that we may not have anticipated. A number of states have what's called a 21st century Fourth Amendment to their state constitution. When our current state constitution was authored, passed, and signed into law in 1971, no one anticipated the collection capabilities with electronic devices. We were talking about paper at the time, essentially, and telephone conversations. And so we're looking at perhaps doing that, which would be broader, so it would better define this as new technologies are rolled out.
Actually, I have some input both on the Stingray, but also there are a lot of private companies, large private companies that are using license plate readers in their corporate garages. They basically, pardon me? Oh, I'm
Say
Jim
who you are.
Southworth from Fairfax County. Okay. There's actually several things going on there that large companies have been using this to even track employee movement within the company, and it's perfectly legal for them to do that within their own company and within their own garages and so on, and for security purposes. The point you made about the Stingray, Richard, there's also something called a femtocell. It's a microcell. It's a small micro tower as such, and they're being installed in buildings. And they can actually generate revenue for the owner of the building, in some cases by agreements with the carriers. There's a side effect. When they do that, they also act like stingrays as well. So they have the ability to actually interrogate and operate on cell phones within the premises. And these are being installed at a rather rapid rate nationwide and in the larger corporations who are concerned about corporate espionage.
Okay, I think we're going to take our final question in the back here. Let's get you a microphone.
Deborah Campbell, Potomac District. And my question is to Chief Hudson, having heard what Representative Anderson is thinking, top of mind, how he may shape the bill. What are your thoughts? How will that either help you or inhibit your job as a police officer?
That's a great question, thank you. And Delegate Anderson and I have had several conversations about this. My one concern about restrictions on what triggers a capture goes back to what I talked about earlier. In terms of historical use of data that's in our system, however long it's in our system, at the point of capture, we won't know what necessarily whether that's going to have a nexus to a criminal event. If we trigger that only with a court order or by the virtue of a crime in progress, we will not essentially have any passive collective data that's used historically. So we will lose the investigative benefit of that information that we have in our system that we can then query, as I mentioned earlier, for example, looking for a companion of a murder suspect who's now driving that person around. We might have days worth or weeks worth of data that we could go back and check to find out if that vehicle showed up so we can locate that person. If we're waiting for a court order to trigger it, by the time we get the court order, we'll have lost all the data captured prior to that. So that would be my concern. But other than that, that's the only concern I have about some of the language that Delegate Anderson has talked about. I fully agree with just about everything else.
Okay, well, I think that brings us to the end of the program, so if we could please just give a round of applause to the panel members. Thank you all very much. And I think I turn this over to Dr. Jack for closing remarks.